They called me a witch, not in jest, not as a nickname from childhood, but as an accusation whispered in a church that once carried my name on the donor plaque. "Bleed, witch," my grandson said, his voice cracking through the echo of hymnals like a whip. The wine slipped from the chalice, dark and sticky, and poured down the front of my skirt. It wasn't the heat of the liquid that burned me, but the silence that followed, that slow collective turning away of eyes. No gasp, no cry of outrage, just the solemn shuffle of bodies pretending to pray harder. And then Father Allen's voice, thin as dust. "Careful, Leo. She built this altar." He said it not in defense but in warning, as if I might rise from the pew and set the place aflame with my bare hands. I didn't. I sat there, the fabric clinging cold to my thighs, and felt the room reconfigure itself around me. I was no longer part of the congregation. I was the story they'd whisper about after coffee and cake in the parish hall. I am 81 years old. I used to lead the flower committee, polish the candlesticks until they caught sunlight like mirrors, sew the purple drapes for Lent by hand because no one else could match the seams. I spent 40 years kneeling here. My knees still ache in a rhythm that matches the Sunday bells. But lately, I've noticed the way people look at me, not unkindly, but as if I've become the dust itself, something that accumulates no matter how often you sweep. My daughter-in-law says I shouldn't walk to church alone anymore. My son agrees, with that careful tone men use when they've already decided something. I ignore them both. There are worse ways to die than on your way to a place that once made you feel useful. That morning, I'd worn my good coat, the navy wool one with the brooch shaped like a lily. It was my husband's favorite. He used to say it made me look like I still had a secret. I pressed it smooth before leaving the house, wrapped the communion bread I'd baked the night before, and prayed for a calm service. I didn't expect beauty, just peace, a brief pocket of stillness before the rest of the day collapsed into small humiliations. I didn't expect Leo to be there either. He rarely comes to Mass. The last time I saw him in this building, he was 6 years old, dressed in a white robe for his first communion, terrified of dropping the host. I remember steadying his little hands, whispering, "It's just bread, love. It's the meaning that's heavy." He laughed then, relieved. That laugh stayed with me for years, even after he stopped visiting. When I saw him that morning, tall, sharp-shouldered, with that expression boys wear when they've discovered sarcasm and mistake it for wisdom, my heart lifted for one small foolish moment. I thought perhaps he'd come because he missed me, but the look he gave me as he passed my pew told a different story. He glanced at me as one might glance at a relic they're ashamed to claim. I almost called out to him. Almost. But I didn't want to embarrass him. That's what mothers and grandmothers learn to do, swallow themselves so the young can have more air. During communion, he carried the chalice down the aisle, helping Father Allen. I was proud despite myself. My Leo, serving at the altar. When he reached me, he paused too long. There was something like defiance in his eyes. Then, with a small twist of his wrist, deliberate, practiced, he tipped the cup. The liquid spilled fast, too fast to be an accident, dark red blooming across my lap, dripping onto the stone floor. The scent of the wine filled the air, sweet and sour, clinging to everything. I looked up, waiting for the apology that never came. His face didn't change. He just whispered that word, witch, not cruelly, not even loudly, but like it was a truth he'd been taught. I wanted to speak, to tell him that when he was a baby, I prayed over his crib every night, that I stitched his baptismal gown myself, that every brick of this church had been paid for with bake sales and raffles and my husband's overtime shifts. I wanted to tell him I had bled already, just not in the way he meant, but I couldn't move. The priest's words came next. Careful, she built this altar. And they fell into the silence like coins dropped into a dry well. No one laughed. No one came to help me stand. The choir began the next hymn as if nothing had happened. After the service, I stayed in my seat long after everyone left. The wine had dried into a brownish stain, sticky under my palms. The janitor passed by, hesitated, and then pretended not to see me. I watched the sunlight crawl across the floor toward the altar steps, turning the dust into tiny sparks. Once, I'd have seen holiness in that. Now it looked like decay. I thought about all the hours I'd spent scrubbing those same tiles, thinking cleanliness was next to godliness. No one tells you that devotion, too, can rot if you leave it in one place too long. When I finally stood, my knees cracked like old wood. I walked to the front, tracing my fingers along the edge of the altar. There was a small chip in the marble I recognized, from the day I dropped a hammer during installation. My husband had laughed, said, "Don't worry, Martha. Even holy things need flaws to let the light in." He's been gone 20 years, and I still hear him sometimes when I stand here alone. That morning, I whispered to the empty space where he might have been, "You see what they've done? You see what they've become?" Outside, the air was brittle with autumn. The church bells rang behind me, 3 slow tolls, then silence. I could see Leo and his parents talking near their car. He gestured sharply, his mother scolding him in that performative way women do when they care more about appearances than apology. My son saw me and froze. He didn't wave, just lowered his eyes and guided them both into the car. The engine started, then faded down the hill. That was when I noticed my reflection in the church window. The coat, the stain, the stiff posture. I looked like a ghost, still waiting to be acknowledged. I walked home slowly, every step measured. People passed me on the street and nodded politely without recognizing me. Once, they'd have stopped me to ask about the next bake sale or the flower rhoda. Now they see only an old woman carrying invisible weight. At home, I set the stained skirt in the sink and poured cold water over it. The wine bled out in slow purple threads, circling the drain. I watched until it was gone. The fabric would never be clean again, but I didn't mind. Some marks are worth keeping. They remind you that even in sacred places, blood is still just blood. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too still, the kind of quiet that hums against your ribs. I kept replaying the moment, the tilt of his wrist, the glint in his eye, the way the priest's voice had carried that odd respect when he said I built this altar. I wondered if he knew what he meant. I wondered if anyone did. Maybe that's what it means to grow old, to become the keeper of meanings that others have forgotten. I sat by the window until dawn, the cup of tea in my hands gone cold. Outside, mist clung to the hedges like breath. I thought of the word witch again, how easily it had left Leo's mouth, how it had landed in me like recognition rather than insult. A witch, yes, a woman who once created something sacred from nothing but her own 2 hands. A woman whose work outlived her welcome. Perhaps that's what frightened them. Perhaps that's why no one helped. The thought didn't wound me as it should have. It steadied me. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of dangerous calm, the kind that comes just before the rebuilding. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, long before the church bells, with the faint metallic taste of yesterday still coating my tongue. The stain had dried into the skirt overnight, a bruise-colored patch that no amount of scrubbing could coax out. I left it hanging on the line in the cold October air, a flag of something I hadn't yet named, surrender or defiance. I wasn't sure which. The kettle hissed on the stove as I waited for the water to boil, the house silent, except for the small creaks of its aging bones. This was the same kitchen where I'd once kneaded bread for parish fundraisers, the same table where my husband used to polish the collection plates before Easter. I'd built my life around service, around being useful, around being the kind of woman who never needed thanks, because gratitude was supposed to be its own reward. But now, standing there in my faded nightgown, the only thing that echoed back from those years of giving was a hollow sound, like the after ring of a struck bell. Around 9, there was a knock at the door, sharp, deliberate, familiar. My son, David. I opened it expecting the perfunctory concern, the tight smile he reserved for unpleasant duties. Instead, he looked exhausted, his tie askew, his jaw clenched. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, brushing past me before I could answer. He smelled of aftershave and irritation. I poured him coffee without asking if he wanted any. That habit, at least, was bone deep. He didn't sit right away, just stood by the window, watching the clothesline sway in the wind. The stained skirt moved slightly, like it was nodding in agreement with some private thought. "You embarrassed us," he said finally, his voice low, as if even the house might overhear and judge him. I laughed before I could stop myself, a small, startled sound that came from somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. "I embarrassed you," I repeated. "He poured wine on me, David, in church." He turned then, quick and defensive. "He's just a kid. He didn't mean it." I stared at him, seeing not the man in his late 40s with a mortgage and thinning hair, but the boy who used to bring me pocketfuls of dandelions and call them sunflowers. "He looked me in the eye when he did it," I said quietly. "He meant it." My son sighed, running a hand through his hair, that old gesture of frustration I'd once found endearing. "You're taking it too seriously. He's going through a phase. You provoked him, maybe. I don't know. You said something. You always say things." I wanted to ask what he thought I'd said. I wanted to remind him that I'd taught Leo his first prayer, that I'd paid for his private school when David couldn't, that every Sunday meal they ever served had started with ingredients from my garden. But the words tangled in my throat, heavy with years of restraint. "Do you even know what he called me?" I asked. "Does it matter?" he replied, too quickly, too easily. That was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but deep beneath the surface of things, like a root splitting the earth. "Yes," I said, "it matters." He looked at me then, startled, maybe even frightened by the steadiness in my voice. He started to say something else, some mixture of justification and apology, but his phone buzzed. He looked down, read the message, and muttered, "I have to go. Carla's waiting." He moved toward the door, stopped for a second, then added without turning around, "Maybe just stay home for a while, Mom. Let things cool off. People talk, you know." And then he was gone. The door closed softly, politely, the way people shut coffins when they want to pretend they'll open them again. I stood there for a long time, the coffee cooling untouched on the table. The phrase "people talk" spun around in my head like a tune I couldn't shake. Of course they did. People had been talking about me for years, first with admiration, then with indulgence, and now with suspicion. The words change, but the mouths stay the same. In small towns, women are either saints or sinners. There's never room for both in one lifetime. I realized then that something had ended, not just the Sunday ritual, not just the illusion of family harmony, but a long, invisible contract I'd signed without reading. The one that said I must always be quiet, grateful, forgiving. The one that demanded I grow smaller each year until I fit neatly inside other people's versions of me. That afternoon I went back to the church. The doors were unlocked as they always were, though it felt different walking through them alone on a weekday. The air inside was cool, scented faintly with candle wax and old polish. I moved down the aisle slowly, my footsteps echoing. Near the altar, the carpet still bore a faint reddish shadow where the wine had spilled. Someone had tried to clean it, but the stain had sunk too deep. I knelt beside it, touching the edge of the mark. My fingers came away clean, but something in me didn't. I thought of Leo's hand, the deliberate tilt, the priest's voice, the stunned faces pretending not to see. I thought of how many times I'd knelt in this exact spot, believing it meant something, that faith was a structure no one could take apart. "Mrs. Delaney," came a voice from behind me. "Father Allen." I hadn't heard him approach. He looked smaller without the robes, his shoulders curved inward like parentheses. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "Why not?" I asked. "You said I built this altar." His mouth twitched as if he regretted the words already. "That was a figure of speech." I smiled, not kindly. "No, Father, it wasn't. You were right. I did build it, with my husband, with years you can't imagine." He looked down, embarrassed, maybe even ashamed. "Leo's a good boy," he said weakly. "He didn't mean harm." I stood then, slowly, the joints complaining. He meant something. Maybe not what you think, but something. And I think you all know it. He shifted, clasping his hands. "Sometimes boys need to test boundaries." I walked past him toward the door. "And sometimes men hide behind them," I said. Outside, the sky was low and gray, a colorless weight pressing against the steeple. I stood there for a while, the wind pushing at my coat. For the first time, I noticed how worn the church sign had become, the paint flaking off around the edges of the word grace. I wondered if anyone else saw it, or if they'd grown too used to decay to recognize it anymore. When I got home, there was a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, just folded paper with my name scrawled across the top in Leo's handwriting. I opened it carefully. "Grandma, I didn't mean to make you mad. I was just joking." Everyone laughed. "It's not a big deal. Please don't make Dad angry with me." I stared at the words, so casual, so practiced. A joke, he'd called it. I folded the paper once, twice, then a third time until it was small enough to disappear in my palm. I didn't tear it. I placed it in the drawer with my rosary instead. Let the sacred and the shameful coexist. It seemed appropriate. That evening, I received a call from one of the church ladies, Margaret Lane. Her voice was syrupy, that slow condescension wrapped in concern. "We're so sorry about what happened, dear," she said, "but you know how teenagers are. Anyway, Father thought maybe it's best if you take a little time away from the altar guild, just until things settle." I almost laughed again. Time away from something I'd built, maintained, and saved more times than they'd ever know. "Of course," I said, because it was easier than explaining that I'd already taken my time away, only none of them had noticed. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the clock tick. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself were thick with something unsaid. Then I understood what the true betrayal was. Not the wine, not the silence, not even my son's cowardice. It was the realization that everything I had poured into them, faith, time, kindness, labor, had turned into a debt I was now being asked to pay. They had mistaken devotion for servitude, and I had let them. That was my sin. Before bed, I went to the closet and touched the navy coat. The fabric was still soft under my fingertips, the brooch gleaming faintly in the lamplight. My husband used to say that faith was like fabric. Stretch it too thin and it tears. I think mine finally had. The thread snapped clean through. I didn't pray that night. I didn't ask for forgiveness or guidance. I just whispered into the quiet room, I am done kneeling. The words hung there for a moment, then settled somewhere deep in me, solid and final. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint toll of the church bell through the trees. It sounded distant, almost unfamiliar, like a language I used to speak but no longer believed in. In the weeks that followed, the silence grew its own architecture, a kind of invisible scaffolding that held up the days while quietly pressing them inward. People still nodded when they passed me on Main Street, but it was the nod of obligation, not recognition. They didn't ask how I was. They asked if I'd been keeping busy, that polite euphemism reserved for the elderly, the widowed, and the inconvenient. I had once been everywhere in this town, my hands on every church event, every charity drive, every raffle ticket sold in the name of community. Now, I was nowhere. It happened subtly, the way all exclusions do, not through confrontation, but omission. One Sunday, the bulletin arrived without my name on the Altar Guild list. The following week, Margaret forgot to call about the meeting, though she managed to ring me the next day to check in. When I asked how the gathering went, she said, "Oh, it was just a quick one, nothing important." And I could hear the clinking of glasses behind her voice, the kind that only accompany important meetings. By the third week, the calls stopped altogether. My chair at the church hall, the one I'd carved my initials under decades ago, was filled by a new woman with a sharp haircut and an eagerness to please. I knew her type. Every generation births another. At home, the air thickened with small neglects. My son stopped calling, except for the obligatory Sunday check-ins that lasted as long as the coffee stayed warm. His wife's voice never joined in anymore. She had perfected the art of absence. I tried at first to fill the void with tasks, the way I always had. I polished the silver, ironed the linens, cleaned the windows even though winter was coming. I baked too much bread, enough for visitors who no longer came. But usefulness, when it has nowhere to go, turns sour inside you. It becomes a restless kind of grief, the kind that hums behind your ribs when the house is too quiet. The days blurred into one another. The church bell, which had once dictated the rhythm of my life, became background noise. I stopped timing my tea by it. I stopped listening altogether. It was on one of those dull afternoons, gray and thin as parchment, that I first noticed the letter on my doorstep. No stamp, no handwriting, just an envelope slipped under the mat. Inside, a folded program from last Sunday's service. At the bottom, in red pen, someone had circled my name, or rather the empty space where it used to be, and written, "Some things end quietly." There was no signature. I read it twice before tearing it into pieces and dropping them into the wastebasket. But that night, I dreamed of the handwriting, its steady loops, too careful, too deliberate. The next morning, when I checked the trash, the scraps were gone. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Age does that, they say. It loosens the edges of certainty until everything feels half-lit. But then the small humiliations began to gather weight. At the grocery store, 2 women from the congregation stopped talking when they saw me. One smiled too quickly, the other pretended to study the oranges. "Poor thing," I heard one whisper as I passed. At the pharmacy, the clerk, a girl I'd known since she was a child in Sunday school, called me dear, and double-bagged my prescription as if embarrassment were contagious. Even the priest avoided my eye when we crossed paths outside the rectory. I began to understand that it wasn't just gossip anymore. It was contagion of another sort. Once a community marks you, the stain spreads faster than truth ever could. I kept busy because I didn't know what else to do. Every morning, I walked to the churchyard to check on the rose bush I'd planted after my husband died. It had been a stubborn thing, blooming late, refusing to die even when the groundskeeper cut it back too harshly. Now, it stood half buried in leaves, its thorns blackened by frost. I bent down to brush the soil from its roots, and a voice behind me said, "You shouldn't be here, Mrs. Delaney." It was Margaret again, her tone honeyed with false sympathy. "Father thinks it's best if you let the younger ladies take over for a while. You've done enough." The phrase hung between us, done enough, a benediction disguised as dismissal. I straightened slowly, my knees protesting. "Enough for whom?" I asked. She didn't answer, just smiled that tight little smile of hers and walked away, her heels clicking like punctuation marks. That night, I went through my drawers, pulling out the old photographs from the parish picnics, the Christmas bazaars, the confirmation classes. There I was, year after year, always in the background, always smiling, holding a tray of cookies, or arranging flowers, or sweeping up after everyone else had gone home. The pictures blurred together into a single truth. I had built something that no one remembered belonged to me. I thought of Father Allen's warning to Leo. She built this altar, and for the first time, I realized how literal it was. I had given them everything: money, labor, prayer, even my reputation. And they had repaid me by rewriting the story to exclude my name. In small towns, erasure comes softly. One day, you're indispensable. The next, you're inconvenient. You don't notice it at first because they still smile, still wave, still say your name. But it's the tone that changes, the faint curvature of pity under every syllable. When you're young, you think exile is a place, but it isn't. It's a tone of voice, averted eyes, conversations that stop when you enter the room. I began to live inside that exile. Winter settled in early. I stopped attending Sunday service, partly out of pride, partly because the cold air made my joints ache. Instead, I listened from my kitchen, the faint echo of the organ drifting through the wind. Once, I thought I heard my name during the intercessions, someone asking for prayers for my health. But when I opened the window, the sound dissolved into the bells. I laughed then, quietly, at the absurdity of it all. You spend a lifetime being the backbone of a place, and when you finally collapse, they mistake the silence for peace. Around Christmas, David visited again, unannounced this time. He brought a basket of fruit, the kind filled more with apology than affection. We sat in the living room, the air thick with polite distance. "You should come by the house," he said. "Carla's been worried." I nearly smiled at that. Carla worried only about things that could be photographed. "I'm fine here," I said. He looked around, noting the quiet, the dust, the single plate drying by the sink. "You shouldn't be alone so much." I wanted to tell him that solitude isn't the same as loneliness, but he wouldn't have understood. For men like him, women only exist in relation to someone else's needs. He stayed 10 minutes, then left, promising to call. I didn't wait for the phone to ring. The days turned shorter, the light more fragile. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the window and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were steady, sharper somehow, but the softness had gone. There was a time when I'd have fought to be included again, begged for forgiveness I didn't owe, baked my way back into their good graces. But something in me had hardened, not out of bitterness, but clarity. I understood now that belonging was conditional, and I'd already paid the price too many times. One evening, as I sat reading by the fire, I heard footsteps outside, not hurried, but purposeful. Then the faint scrape of something against the door. When I opened it, the porch was empty, but another envelope lay on the mat. This one contained no words, just a torn piece of my own photograph from the church bulletin years ago, my face cut neatly down the middle. I held it under the lamplight, the edges clean, surgical. There was no fear, only recognition. I'd seen this kind of cruelty before. It was the same kind that smiles at you in daylight and prays for your soul at night. I slipped the photo into the drawer beside Leo's letter and the rosary. Together, they formed a small archive of betrayal, quiet and precise. As the weeks passed, I stopped opening the curtains in the morning. The light felt too harsh, too revealing. Instead, I found comfort in the half-dark, where memory and imagination could blur without contradiction. I thought often of my husband, of how he used to say that faith wasn't in the church walls, but in the hands that built them. I wondered what he'd say now, seeing the way those same hands had turned against me. Perhaps he'd tell me to leave it all behind. Perhaps he'd say I'd done my part. But I wasn't ready to abandon the place that had been my life's work. Not yet. I wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction. And so I began a small ritual of my own. Every Sunday, while the congregation gathered at the main church, I walked to the edge of town where the old chapel stood, the one long since boarded up, its roof half collapsed, its windows opaque with dust. It had been our first parish, my husband's and mine, before the new building went up. The council had deemed it unsafe, too costly to repair, and closed it years ago. But the lock on the side door was weak. It gave easily under my hand. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and forgotten prayers. The pews were crooked, the altar stripped bare, but the bones of holiness were still there. I sat on the cold floor and listened to the wind move through the cracks. It sounded like a hymn no one remembered the words to. In that ruin, I felt more at peace than I had in months. No one watching, no whispers, no pity, just silence, honest and raw. I traced my fingers over the grooves in the old stone, the initials carved by generations of parishioners long gone. One of them was mine, MD plus HD, carved by my husband's pocket knife the day we finished repainting the doors. I smiled then, the first true smile in a long while. The altar might have been stripped, but faith, like grief, always finds a way to return to the ruins. That was how the first escalation ended, not with confrontation, not with victory, but with the quiet understanding that erasure can be resisted simply by refusing to disappear. The church might forget me, the town might turn away, but the stones still remembered my hands, and for now, that was enough. I began to go back to the chapel every day, not as a pilgrim or a penitent, but as a woman who needed to see proof that her touch still mattered. The first mornings were cold, my breath forming small clouds that lingered in the damp air before vanishing. But I preferred that kind of solitude, the clean emptiness of a place long forgotten by everyone but the wind. The chapel stood half swallowed by ivy, its bell long gone, its door hanging slightly off the hinges, yet there was a quiet dignity in its decay. I carried with me a small pail, a rag, and a jar of oil for the hinges. Each day I did one small thing, swept a corner, wiped the dust from the pews, straightened a fallen hymn book, replaced a pane of cracked glass with a scrap of clear plastic. None of it was enough to restore the building, but the rhythm of the work began to restore me. There was something grounding about touching wood that had known centuries of prayer. I didn't kneel anymore. I didn't have to. Faith had changed shape. It no longer required permission nor witness. On the third day, I found the key to the vestry wedged under the loose step by the entrance, the same place I'd hidden it 20 years before when the council voted to close the chapel. I had forgotten it existed, or perhaps I had simply needed to forget until now. The key was rusted, but it turned easily, as though the lock had been waiting for my hand. Inside the vestry, the air was thick with mildew and old paper. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with candle stubs, hymnals, and boxes of forgotten linens. In one corner stood the old altar cross, tarnished but unbroken. I lifted it carefully, wiped away the grime, and set it on the table. The metal caught the thin beam of morning light and gave a brief trembling shimmer before going still again. I whispered then, not a prayer exactly, but something close to gratitude, as if the building itself had let out a slow sigh of relief. Soon, tending the chapel became my unspoken ritual. I would rise before dawn, wrap myself in my husband's old coat, and make the slow walk across town. Some mornings I carried candles, others a thermos of tea. Once I brought a small radio and let the faint hum of classical music fill the space while I worked. The neighbors must have seen me leave, but no one asked where I went. Perhaps they thought I was visiting the cemetery. It didn't matter. Secrecy gave the work its holiness. I was no longer performing piety for anyone's comfort. I was reclaiming it, piece by piece, dust by dust. By the second week, I'd managed to scrub the floor until the faint mosaic beneath emerged again, small fragments of colored tile forming a pattern of lilies and doves. I had forgotten how beautiful it was. I traced the design with my fingertip, thinking of the hours my husband and I had spent laying those tiles ourselves, one winter when we were young and broke but determined. He had joked that someday, when the world forgot our names, the floor would remember our patience. I smiled at that memory and felt, for the first time in months, the weight of grief ease from my shoulders. The world could erase names, but it couldn't unmake the work of hands. One afternoon, as I polished the brass candle holders, I heard footsteps outside, hesitant, light, the sound of someone uncertain whether they were trespassing. I froze, listening. The door creaked open, and a small voice said, "Hello?" It was a girl, no more than 10, with a wool hat pulled low over her ears and a backpack slung crookedly across her shoulder. "Are you the cleaning lady?" she asked, her tone polite but curious. I wanted to laugh, but instead I said, "Something like that." She stepped inside, her boots crunching softly on the gravel floor. "My grandmother said this place was haunted," she said. "Is it?" I looked around at the faint light filtering through the broken windows, at the shadows pooling in the corners. "Only by memory," I said. "That's not scary," she replied. "Then you're braver than most." She smiled, showing a gap where a tooth was missing. "Can I help?" I hesitated, then handed her the rag. "If you're not afraid of dust." She wasn't. That girl, her name was Sophie, began coming by after school. At first, she just watched, her eyes wide as I worked, but soon she took to cleaning the windows, humming under her breath. She asked questions the way children do, endless and unfiltered. "Why do you come here if it's broken?" she asked one afternoon. I thought about the answer before saying, "Because broken things still belong to someone." She seemed to understand that, in her own way. When she left that day, she waved from the gate and said, "See you tomorrow, witch lady." I stared after her, startled. Then I laughed, a sound that felt almost foreign. She didn't mean it cruelly. To her, it was a title, not an accusation. The chapel began to change under our hands. Slowly, the layers of neglect peeled back to reveal color again. The windows, once opaque with grime, began to let light in, and that light seemed to move differently through the space, softer, more forgiving. The first time I lit a candle on the restored altar, the flame burned straight and steady, without flickering. I took it as a sign, not from God, but from the work itself, that resurrection doesn't always need miracles. Sometimes it only needs a stubborn heart and time. It was during those weeks that I began to speak aloud again, not to anyone, but to the air, to the stones, to whatever invisible listener had been waiting all this time. I told the chapel everything, the story of the wine, the silence, the exile, the ache that comes from being forgotten by the people you once held up. I didn't weep. I simply told it, like filing a record for the archives. The walls didn't echo back judgment or pity, only a kind of listening that felt truer than any confession I'd ever given. One evening, as the sun slid low through the stained glass, I found myself whispering to my husband again. "You'd laugh if you saw me now," I said, restoring what they buried. I imagined his hand, calloused and sure, resting over mine as it used to when we painted the railings together. "You always said I'd outlive their gratitude," I added softly. "You were right." The light shifted, glancing off the brass cross, so that for one brief moment the whole room glowed red and gold. I stood there, still and quiet, until the color faded. The next Sunday, I stayed home and baked bread. Not the kind for communion, just ordinary loaves, dense, fragrant, real. As I kneaded the dough, I realized I hadn't thought about Leo in days. His name, once a splinter in my mind, had begun to lose its sting. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was distance, and distance can sometimes heal more honestly than prayer. I wrapped 2 loaves in cloth and carried them to the chapel. When I arrived, Sophie was already there, humming again, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Smells nice," she said. We ate in silence, the sound of the wind against the windows our only company. At one point, she asked, "Do you think the people who forgot this place will ever come back?" I tore a piece of bread, handed it to her, and said, "Maybe not." But we did. That night, I lay in bed with the scent of dust and flour still on my hands. I felt something shifting inside me, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't surrender. It was reclamation, the slow turning of grief into purpose. I realized that I didn't need the church's approval to keep believing in what I had built. Faith, stripped of hierarchy and gossip, could be a private thing, like tending a garden that no one else knew existed. A week later, I found a small box on the chapel steps. Inside was a bundle of white linen, freshly washed, folded with care. No note. I knew at once it had come from Margaret, though she'd never admit it. The gesture wasn't reconciliation. It was unease. The living never know what to do with those who refuse to vanish. I placed the linen on the altar and smiled. Even fear, when wrapped in courtesy, can become an offering. That was the midpoint of my story, though I didn't know it then. The quiet pivot from being erased to becoming something uncontainable. I was no longer waiting to be welcomed back. I was building something that didn't require permission, something older and wilder than the approval of small minds. The chapel, with its cracks and its silence, had become my confession and my absolution all at once. I didn't rebuild it for them. I rebuilt it for the part of myself that still believed beauty could survive abandonment. And as I locked the door that evening, the sky burning low over the fields, I felt an almost fierce peace, the kind that comes only after long humiliation has finally burned itself clean. The first real trouble began on a Thursday in late February, a morning so cold the breath froze between the words you meant to say. I had gone to the chapel early, as always, the sky still bruised with dawn. The snow on the ground was thin and brittle, crunching underfoot like old paper. I carried a new candle with me, one thick and ivory, bought from the general store with the last of the Christmas sale stock. It felt good in my hands, solid and simple, a small rebellion against the emptiness that still hovered over town. Inside, the chapel was darker than usual. I struck a match, lit the wick, and watched the flame stretch itself awake. I had begun to think of that light as something personal, mine, though I had no right to claim ownership of fire. I set it on the altar, polished the brass cross until it shone again, and started sweeping the floor. That was when I heard it, footsteps on the gravel outside, slow but heavy, the sound of someone who didn't want to sneak but didn't belong either. I turned, expecting Sophie. Instead, I saw my daughter-in-law, Carla. She stood in the doorway, her coat too fine for the wind, her scarf bright against the ruin around her. She looked at the candle, at the broom in my hand, then back at me with that small, polite pity she'd perfected over the years. "So it's true," she said finally. "You've been coming here." I didn't answer right away. The silence between us had a texture to it, like gauze pulled too tight. "Someone has to keep it from collapsing," I said. "It's condemned," she replied, her voice soft but sharp. "You shouldn't even be here. David's worried. The neighbors talk." I almost laughed. The neighbors had been talking since the day I buried my husband, and they hadn't stopped since. "Let them," I said, turning back to the broom. She stepped further in, heels clicking against the stone. "Mom, listen to me. You can't keep doing this. It's not healthy. You're alone out here, talking to yourself, playing in the dirt. It's not normal." Normal. That word again. The dull blade of every life that ever tried to cut a woman down to size. I looked at her, this woman who had never known hunger or sacrifice or the strange holiness of loneliness, and felt the kind of pity that has no room left for anger. "You don't know what normal means," I said. "You think it's what happens when no one asks questions, but normal is just another word for obedient." Her mouth tightened. "We're trying to help you." I set the broom aside, wiped my hands on my skirt, and faced her. "You mean control." She sighed, took a step closer. "We've been talking to someone, a counselor. She specializes in elder care. She thinks it might be time to consider some support, someone to check in, maybe even a move to somewhere safer." The word safer landed like a slap. I had known, deep down, this would come eventually, but the reality of it still stung. I turned away so she wouldn't see my face. "A home," I said quietly. "You mean an institution." "Don't make it sound cruel," she said, almost pleading now. "It's not punishment. You'd have people your age, activities, care." I laughed then, long and low. The sound startled her. "Care," I repeated, "from strangers paid by the hour, while you and David visit once a month and call it duty." She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand. "Stop. You're wasting your rehearsed concern on someone who's already seen through the script." She looked smaller then, uncertain, as if she'd wandered into the wrong scene of her own life. "Leo's been asking about you," she said finally, her voice changing shape, reaching for sentiment. "He's sorry, you know. He feels terrible about what happened." I stared at her, wondering if she even believed it. He wrote me a letter, I said. He called it a joke. Her eyes flickered. He's young. He's cruel, I corrected. Cruelty doesn't need age. It needs permission. I turned back to the altar, rearranging the candles just to have something steady to do. Tell David not to send anyone. If they come, I won't open the door. She hesitated, maybe wanting to say more, but in the end, she just adjusted her gloves and left. Her perfume lingered long after she was gone, a sharp floral scent that clashed with the damp air. For the rest of that day, I couldn't shake the tremor in my hands. The broom slipped twice. I broke one of the glass panes while trying to wipe the inside. Every sound outside felt like a footstep. I knew they would not let the matter rest, and I was right. 3 days later, a man came to my door, a stranger in a gray coat, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Delaney?" he asked, though he already knew. He introduced himself as Mr. Hoffman, a representative from the county's elder services. "We've had some concerns raised by your family. They're worried about your well-being." His voice was practiced, the kind that had said the same thing too many times. I invited him in, poured him tea, and listened while he spoke about transitions and quality of life. I nodded in all the right places, my hands folded neatly on the table. Then, when he finished, I opened the drawer by the sink and took out a folder. Inside were my power of attorney papers, updated 6 months ago. I had transferred all rights and financial authority to a lawyer in town, one who owed me more favors than he cared to admit. I slid the papers across the table. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but as you can see, I'm fully competent, and my affairs are in order. You may tell my family that I'm not their project." He left soon after, uncomfortable, the kind of man who preferred docility to defiance. As his car pulled away, I stood by the window and felt a slow warmth spread through me. Not triumph, but something steadier, older, like the hum of survival itself. I knew they'd be furious. Let them. I had been underestimated long enough. The following week, the snow melted into gray slush, and with it came whispers. At the store, people glanced at me and looked away. At the post office, the clerk avoided my eyes. I could feel it, the way stories morph, how pity curdles into suspicion. "She's losing it," they'd say. "Poor thing, can't accept her age." But behind their careful tones was something else, something like fear. Perhaps they didn't know what to make of a woman who refused to vanish when told to. One afternoon, as I walked back from the chapel, I saw Leo leaning against a lamppost near my gate. I hadn't seen him since that morning in church. He'd grown taller, thinner, his hair longer in that way boys wear when they're trying to look older than they are. When he saw me, he straightened, shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, and said, "Dad told me to check on you." I kept walking. "I'm fine." "They think you're not," he said, following. "They think you're going crazy." The word hit harder than I expected. I stopped, turned to face him. "Is that what you think?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. You talk to ghosts, right?" His smirk was almost identical to his mother's. "You spilled the wine on me," I said. "Do you even remember?" He kicked at the gravel. "I said I was sorry." "No," I said softly. "You said it was a joke." He met my eyes then, for the first time without defiance, just confusion. "You scared me," he muttered. "Everyone said you were weird. You always looked at me like you knew something I didn't." That startled me, the honesty of it. "I did," I said. "I knew you'd forget where you came from the moment someone told you forgetting was fashionable." He looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just sighed. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Grandma. It's not safe." The word again, safe, the family's favorite leash. I've been unsafe my whole life, I said. It never killed me. He didn't know what to do with that. After a moment, he left, walking fast down the street, shoulders hunched. I watched him go, feeling neither anger nor sorrow, only a strange pity that felt heavier than grief. The next day, a letter arrived, official this time, a notice from the parish council, signed by Father Allen. It informed me that the old chapel was private property of the diocese and that unauthorized entry constituted trespassing. There was a request, no, a demand, that I cease all activity there immediately. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and set it beside the candle on my kitchen table. The wax had pooled in uneven circles, forming small translucent walls. I thought about the word trespass. It means to enter without permission. But how can you trespass on something your hands built? The notion was laughable. Still, I knew the warning was only the beginning. Sure enough, the next Sunday, I found the side door of the chapel nailed shut. A fresh padlock glinted in the light. I stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at my coat, the air full of the smell of wet earth. The act was deliberate, petty, but not unexpected. I turned away and walked around to the back, where the vestry door still hung loosely on its hinges. It took only a little pressure, a little memory of old tricks, and it gave way. Inside, everything was as I'd left it. The air smelled faintly of wax and dust. I lit a candle anyway. If they wanted to call it trespass, let them. I had already decided that holiness belonged to whoever showed up. Later that week, Margaret appeared at my house. She looked nervous, wringing her hands around her purse strap. "I'm just the messenger," she said before I could speak. "The council's upset. Father Allen's been under pressure. There are rumors you've been lighting candles in there again. It's becoming awkward." I stared at her, this woman who had once called me her dearest friend, and saw in her eyes the cowardice of someone who mistook compliance for virtue. "Awkward," I said. "That's the word you use for betrayal?" She flushed. "Don't be dramatic. We all care about you, Martha. We just think it's time you moved on." I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Margaret, when you dust the pews on Sunday, do you think of the hands that paid for them? Do you think of who scrubbed the floors after your children's weddings? Or does history only matter when it flatters you?" She opened her mouth, closed it again, then stood. "You're twisting things," she said weakly. "I'll pray for you." I smiled, not kindly. "Pray louder, then." After she left, I sat for a long while in the quiet house, staring at the flickering candle on the table. The flame tilted toward the window, toward the world that had decided it was done with me. And then, without planning it, I began to write. I pulled out a pad of paper and started a letter, not to the church, not to the family, but to myself. I wrote down everything I had never said, the years of invisible labor, the sacrifices disguised as duty, the slow erosion of being needed only when convenient. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words blurred. When I finished, I folded the pages and tucked them into the drawer beside the rosary and the torn photograph. That night, I dreamed of the chapel again, only it wasn't empty this time. The pews were filled with women, old, young, familiar, strangers, all silent, all watching. They didn't look like ghosts. They looked like witnesses. When I woke, my pillow was damp, though I couldn't tell if it was from tears or sweat. The morning light had changed. It felt sharper, like something about to break. In the days that followed, I noticed small signs that the world around me was shifting too. The council's letter must have spread, because people no longer spoke to me at all. At the grocer's, conversation stopped mid-sentence when I approached. At the pharmacy, The clerk handed me my bag with her eyes lowered. I had become a story again, only now it was darker, more convenient for them, and yet, oddly, I felt freer than I had in years. They could gossip all they liked. They couldn't touch what I had rebuilt. Then, one evening, I found the chapel door wide open. Inside, the candles were gone, the linens folded neatly on the altar, and in their place a single note. This ends now. No signature, no threat, just finality. I stood there, reading it in the half-light, and realized I was no longer afraid. Their power ended where my endurance began. I sat on the floor, the stone cold beneath me, and whispered, "It never ends, not really." The second escalation had begun, not with a battle, but with the quiet certainty that they would never stop trying to claim what they couldn't understand. They thought they were protecting their reputation, their order, their version of faith, but what they feared most was a woman who refused to die in silence. And as I blew out the candle and watched the smoke rise, I knew the next step would come soon, a reckoning not chosen, but necessary. It was on the morning of Palm Sunday that I decided what had to be done. The decision arrived not as an act of rebellion, but as a calm inevitability, the way a tide returns to shore after pretending to recede. The town had already turned its back, the church had closed its doors, and even my own family had reduced me to a whisper of inconvenience. Yet the chapel, my chapel, though I no longer dared to call it that aloud, waited like an abandoned heart, still capable of beating, if someone remembered to listen. I had not gone there for nearly 2 weeks, obeying the letter from the diocese, not out of submission, but strategy. Sometimes you have to let silence grow fat before you pierce it. That morning, I dressed carefully, the ritual soothing in its precision, the navy coat brushed clean, the brooch pinned in the exact place my husband always adjusted it, the scarf wrapped twice around my neck. I took with me the small wooden box that held the last candle, the one I'd been saving, the one I had blessed myself. The streets were nearly empty. From the direction of the main church came the distant sound of singing, bright and hollow. I walked past the houses with their tidy lawns and curtains drawn, past the bakery that used to sell my pies during the bazaars, past the square where the children were probably waving their palm fronds, unaware of how easily ritual becomes theater. The chapel waited at the edge of the woods, its roof glistening faintly with the morning frost. When I reached it, I found the door chained shut, 2 thick loops of metal threaded through a new padlock. The sight of it did not surprise me. I had brought wire cutters in my coat pocket. They were old, the handles wrapped in tape, but they still worked. It took 3 strong squeezes before the chain fell, the links clattering onto the frozen ground with a sound that startled even the crows. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of stone, damp, and ashes. Someone had been there. There were muddy footprints near the altar, the remains of burnt wax scattered on the floor. They had taken the cross again, the brass one I'd polished so many times, but they'd left behind the stand, as if the absence of the symbol mattered more than the act of devotion itself. I walked slowly down the aisle, my footsteps echoing. The silence was so complete that I could hear the faint rush of my own blood in my ears. I set the wooden box on the altar and opened it. Inside were a candle, a lighter, and a small folded paper. On it, I had written the names of every woman I'd known who had built something and been forgotten for it. My mother, my sisters, the women who cleaned and stitched and fed without ever being called founders. Their names looked fragile on the page, but I knew what weight they carried. I placed the candle in the center, struck the lighter, and watched the flame bloom. The light trembled at first, then steadied, as if remembering what it was for. I stood back and waited. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. The flame bent toward it, then straightened again, unbothered. I began to speak, not loudly, not as a sermon, but as one might read a letter aloud to an absent friend. I said their names, one by one, and after each name I said, "Present." The word filled the space like an answer. When I finished, I closed my eyes and let the silence settle again. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slowly. It was Father Allen, his face pale, his coat half-buttoned, as if he'd left in haste. "Martha," he said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" I smiled faintly. "Finishing what I started." He stepped closer, hands raised in that gesture priests use when they want to look both gentle and in control. "You can't do this. The bishop has ordered this place sealed. It's not safe." I looked at him, really looked, and saw not authority, but fear. "You mean it's not safe for you," I said. "Because if I can make something sacred without your permission, what use are you then?" He winced, the truth of it pressing against his composure. "People are worried about you," he said. "Your family." "My family sent strangers to measure my sanity," I interrupted. "They took away my altar, my work, my place, and now you've come to take my silence. You can't have that too." He moved toward me as if to extinguish the candle, but I stepped between him and the flame. "If you touch it," I said, "you'll have to explain why an old woman lighting a candle frightens you." His hand hovered in the air, then dropped. For a long moment, we stood there in that suspended stillness, two remnants of different faiths staring across the divide. Finally, he said quietly, "What do you want, Martha?" I thought about the question. It was the first time anyone had asked it without condescension. "I want this place remembered," I said. "I want truth given a name." He shook his head. "You can't force people to remember." "No," I said, "but you can make forgetting inconvenient." Outside, I heard the crunch of more footsteps. The door creaked, and sunlight spilled across the floor. My son stood there, his expression drawn and tired, Carla behind him, and, of course, Leo, hovering uncertainly at the threshold. For a moment, no one spoke. The three of them looked at me as though I were something fragile and dangerous, a relic humming with unspent energy. "Mom," David said softly, "please, come home." I turned my gaze on him, and for the first time in years, he looked small to me, the way he had when he was a boy asking for comfort. "Home?" I said. "I am home." Carla took a step forward. "You're scaring everyone. Look around you. This isn't normal." I felt a laugh rise in my throat, but let it die before it reached my mouth. "Normal," I said again, "is a story written by people who benefit from obedience." Leo's voice cut through the tension, thin but urgent. "Grandma, please don't be weird. Just come with us. We'll fix this." I turned to him, to the boy who had once poured wine on me as though cleansing the church of my shadow. "You can't fix what you don't understand," I said, "and you can't destroy what you didn't build." His eyes filled, not with remorse exactly, but with the shock of seeing me as something more than a problem to solve. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered. "You did," I said gently, "and now you know what it looks like when the hurt survives." Father Allen cleared his throat. "This isn't the way," he said. "You've made your point. Blow out the candle and come outside." I looked at the flame, then back at him. "No," I said, "the point hasn't been made yet." And with that, I reached into the wooden box and took out the folded paper with the names. I held it to the flame. The edges caught quickly, curling into black. The smoke rose in a single, unwavering column. "These are the forgotten," I said, "and I'm giving them back their light." The paper burned down to my fingers before I let it fall, the ashes scattering across the stone floor like spilled prayers. Carla gasped. David took a step forward, then stopped. Leo stared, transfixed, his face caught between fear and awe. The fire did not spread. It stayed contained, precise, almost reverent. I turned to Father Allen. "You built your altar with words," I said. "I built mine with hands. You can burn the building. You can exile the woman, but you can't unmake what's already been consecrated by labor." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air itself seemed to thicken, vibrating with the weight of something irretrievable. Finally, the priest said, almost to himself, "Careful. She built this altar." The echo of his own words from that Sunday months ago filled the space, and this time it sounded less like a warning and more like a benediction. I stepped back, letting the candle burn on. "Take them outside," I said, my voice low but steady. "This is between me and what's left of my faith." David hesitated, torn between fear and duty. Carla tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently. Leo lingered, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, one by one, they retreated, the door closing softly behind them. I was alone again, the light dimming as clouds crossed the sun. I could feel the cold seeping through my shoes, but I didn't move. I thought of all the years spent cleaning, baking, organizing, praying, for them, for the church, for a version of belonging that had never truly included me. I thought of every woman who had been silenced by the polite violence of dismissal, and then I whispered, "No more." I took the candle from the altar, carried it to the center of the chapel, and set it on the floor. The flame danced higher, casting my shadow across the walls. For a brief second, it looked enormous, towering, uncontainable. I smiled then, not with joy, but with the calm that comes from completion. The chapel didn't need saving anymore. It had already served its purpose. It had been the crucible where I burned away everything that wasn't mine. When I finally stepped outside, the sky had cleared. The wind carried the faint sound of distant bells from the main church, calling others to worship. I looked toward the town and then back at the small, crumbling building behind me. Smoke curled from the open doorway where the candle still burned, thin and silver against the air. I didn't wait to see it go out. Some flames are meant to keep burning long after you stop watching. By the time I reached home that evening, the light had turned to amber, that slow, forgiving color that blurs the edges of everything. My hands still smelled faintly of smoke and wax, though I had washed them twice at the pump behind the chapel. The walk had steadied me. I didn't hurry. There was no longer anything to escape and nothing left to prove. The streets were quiet, emptied of their Sunday pride. A few curtains moved as I passed, but no one came out. They would have heard already. Someone would have called the fire department, or the priest, or perhaps my son. They'd gather the pieces, put their careful explanations together, and by morning, the story would already belong to them. I knew how towns like ours worked. They'll say the old woman lost her mind, that she went too far, that it was tragic and sad, but not surprising. They'll nod, relieved to have an ending that fits the gossip. But the truth, my truth, would stay where it belonged, inside the stones that had outlasted their prayers. When I stepped through my own door, the air inside was warmer than I expected. The small fire I'd left in the grate had burned down to a gentle glow. I hung up my coat, folded it neatly over the chair, and sat beside the window. Outside, a few flakes of snow began to drift down, hesitant at first, then steadier, as if the sky had decided to begin again. I made tea, the way I always did, measuring each motion with deliberate care. It felt strange to realize that I was no longer waiting for anyone. For so long, my life had been shaped by waiting, for my husband's return from work, for my son's phone call, for the priest's approval, for some acknowledgement that what I gave had meaning. But waiting is another form of obedience, and I was done with both. The stillness that filled the house wasn't loneliness anymore. It was ownership. I sat with my tea and watched the street lamps flicker to life. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, short and sharp, then faded. I wondered whether they had reached the chapel yet, whether they'd see the candlelight and think it accidental. Perhaps Father Allen would tell them it was the act of a confused mind. Perhaps David would beg them to be gentle with me. It didn't matter. The candle had burned exactly as long as it needed to. What happens to a flame after it's done its work is no longer the flame's concern. Around 8, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Sophie standing there, cheeks pink from the cold, her wool hat pulled low. She held something in her hands, a small wooden box, the kind children use for treasures. "You left this," she said softly. I looked down. It was my box, the one that had held the last candle. She must have gone to the chapel after I'd left. "It's all right, love," I said. "Keep it." But she shook her head. "It's not mine. It's yours." I took it, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "Are you in trouble?" I smiled. "Not the kind that matters." She frowned in that serious way children have when they sense something too large for words. "Will they fix it?" she asked. "The chapel?" I looked past her toward the faint orange glow on the horizon. "No," I said, "but maybe they'll remember why it was worth building." She nodded slowly, as if memorizing the answer, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small candle stub. "I found it on the floor," she said. "It still works." She placed it on my palm, and for the first time in years, I felt the warmth of inheritance, not the kind measured in property or praise, but the kind that passes quietly between women when no one is looking. After she left, I sat again by the fire, holding the small candle between my fingers. The wax was soft from the heat of her hand. I thought of my grandson then, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with a strange tenderness I didn't expect. He would grow up believing he'd witnessed something shameful, that his grandmother had lost her way. Maybe, in time, he'd learn to look past the version of me they'd all agreed upon. Maybe he'd stand in a church one day and hear the priest say, "Careful, she built this altar," and understand that the warning had always been a confession. I placed the candle on the table, struck a match, and watched the wick catch. The flame was small, steady, obedient at first, then stretching taller, as if recognizing the room. Its light brushed across the framed photographs on the mantel, my husband smiling beside the half-built chapel, David as a boy holding a hammer too large for his hands, myself kneeling among the Easter lilies. All those versions of me, frozen in time, each one certain of what came next. I felt no need to correct them. There is mercy in letting old selves rest where they belong. The hours drifted quietly. I wrote for a while in my journal, not about the fire or the argument or the years of silence, but about the small things that still felt alive. The smell of baking bread, the way snow makes even ugly things seem gentle, the sound of my own breath steady in the dark. I wrote until the pen ran out of ink, then set it down and watched the candle burn lower. Its wax pooled across the table like a map without borders. I thought of the chapel again, of the women whose names I had burned into the air, and I whispered them once more, softer this time, not as invocation, but as gratitude. Each name felt like a heartbeat. When the clock struck midnight, I opened the window to let the smoke drift out. The air was sharp, crystalline, the stars scattered across the sky with reckless generosity. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small beneath them. The town slept below, its lights dim and ordinary, unaware that something had already shifted. Somewhere in the ruins of the chapel, embers still glowed faintly beneath the stone, stubborn as memory. I imagined the wind carrying that warmth through the cracks, through the earth, into the roots of the trees nearby. Perhaps, come spring, something new would grow there, a weed, a wildflower, a beginning. I closed the window, finished my tea, and sat a while longer in the quiet. The candle on the table flickered, then steadied again, its final act before surrender. I didn't blow it out. I let it decide its own ending. The room filled with that tender half-light that makes everything look both old and eternal. I thought then of all the women who might come after me, women who would be told to stay quiet, to wait their turn, to be grateful for half the space they've earned. To them, I wanted to say what I had learned too late, that silence is not peace, that obedience is not grace, and that every altar, no matter who claims it, was built by hands like ours. The flame fluttered once more, as if it had heard me, then settled into stillness. The clock ticked on. Outside, the snow fell without hurry, each flake dissolving against the window pane before it could leave a mark. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of wax and smoke, the two oldest proofs that something has lived. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not erased, not pitied, not feared, only present.